Okay then. I think we are recording. I sincerely hope that we are recording. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 203. I am your host, Pannobhasa, and I have made a conscientious effort to work this out so that there is no audio lag on this video by rebooting the computer right before starting this video. Maybe that'll work. Rebooting computers actually works wonders sometimes. I had to do that at work the other day. It wouldn't read my badge, to get into the secret information at work, trade secrets and stuff. Reboot the computer, worked fine. So let's just hope that it works this time. And the CPU is down at 11.8%. Everything's fine. Let's just go with that. Oh, I forgot to increase the size of the print so I won't be squinting quite so much. Let's see, get it up to 42 points. There we go. Okay then. And you may have noticed that this isn't the usual day for me to upload a question and answer video, because this past weekend, I usually do my Q&A videos on Saturday or Sunday. I was working 12.5-hour shifts Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I was working more than half the time, and then most of the rest of the time, I was sleeping. I'm going to turn on the fan. That's what I'm going to do. Nice. So now it's right around midnight on, what the hell? I'll put it on high. So it's right around midnight on a Monday night. So it's going to go out on Tuesday, it looks like. I've just got weird hours now. And so we're going to have to be flexible with regard to these Q&As and the scheduling of same. Because sometimes I'm going to be working 12.5-hour shifts all weekend. It's like half the time. And half of that time it'll be days, other half nights. Like lately I've been working nights. It's like 5:30 p.m. to 6 in the morning. Which is all right. I'm not complaining. I prefer working nights to having to get up at like 4 in the morning, which is going to be half the time. This is my beverage. And I was going to say something else, but I don't remember what it was, so I guess it wasn't very important. So, 203 is not a prime number. Some of you may have thought it was a prime number. You're all geared up to celebrate the primeness of it. It's 7 times 29. So, get used to it. Here, I got to adjust this a little more. Wearing a new shirt that's like 2 sizes too big. My beloved wife overestimates me to some degree. I guess Freud defined romantic love as overestimation of the sex object. And so she gets me clothes that are way too big. She got me some boots that were like an inch too long, at least an inch. And now it's this shirt, which, of course, a shirt that's too big is still wearable. I guess it's in style to wear like baggy shirts. So it's all good. And I guess may as well just start answering questions. This is going to be kind of a low-key one, I think. I'm not going to be as animated as usual, probably, just because it's after midnight already. And I don't know, this is my first day off after 12.5-hour shifts, and I'm just kind of feeling lazy, just wanting to relax all day. My only real work project all day was cleaning the filter in the pond fountain, which is one of my prides and joys, I guess. My wife contributed to it to some degree, especially with regard to there's like a bog area on one side and some floating plants. She gave some input with regard to the exact size and shape of it, but mostly it was like my inspiration. And I do spend a lot of time just like looking out the window at the pond. It's right outside our bedroom window, the fountain and the goldfishes swimming around. I don't think any loaches survived, so I'm going to have to revise my strategy with regard to inoculating the pond with dojo loaches. Somehow endlers, which are like guppies, got into the pond and they're like having a population explosion, which is not particularly good because when winter comes, I mean, goldfish can survive freezing temperatures. I'm pretty sure endlers can't. And so there's going to be a die-off of hundreds of little fishes all at the same time when winter hits. But we'll just cross that bridge when we get to it. And I'm just going to start answering questions. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, is it possible that there were enlightened Vikings or Mongols who committed genocide and mass rape? If enlightenment has no meaning in a samsaric context, and the actions of the body just do what it does, then this would be a strange combination. Well, I mean, enlightenment obviously has meaning, like verbally. You can define it verbally in a samsaric context. What I'm saying is, can it really exist within the limits of samsara? I mean, you can get close to it. You know, it's like a person can become wiser and more saintly and wiser and more saintly, but can they get to the point of just absolute perfection with regard to their wisdom and purity within a samsaric context? That is another question. So, I mean, even using like samsaric definitions, an enlightened being, for one thing, they wouldn't have Pink Floyd's Wall. You know, it's like they would have compassion. An enlightened being would have compassion because they wouldn't be like closed off to the suffering of other beings around them to the extent that beings really exist, and on and on. I mean, it's hard to really discuss the mental states of an enlightened being intelligently or coherently because, again, I mean, second guessing the mental states of an enlightened being, which may or may not even really exist in a samsaric context, is an exercise in futility. But let's just go with like a more or less Buddhist approach, or even just common sense. Like an enlightened person is going to be wiser than the average person, and they're not going to be motivated by hatred and, you know, just ill will. You know, they may have some aggressive tendencies. They may, you know, have human emotions to some degree. You know, they may express anger, even though in Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, a fully enlightened being doesn't get angry. They no delusion, no greed, hate, or delusion. But somebody like Neem Karoli Baba up there on top of the bookcase, I mean, he would yell, he would hit people, he would giggle, he would cry. You know, he just had the full spectrum of human emotions, it seems like. I don't know if he actually expressed hatred, but I mean, a lot of the human emotions were still, you know, part of his repertoire. So you would think that a fully enlightened being, or someone who's very close to being a fully enlightened being, an extremely wise person, would, I mean, they would not be motivated by, you know, murderous berserker rage, for example. So I really doubt that an extremely wise person would be participating knowingly and willingly in genocide and mass. And it's a word I'm not supposed to say on YouTube. I've already let it slip once. Just, it's in quotes. You know, I'm not endorsing it in any way. So, let's see. Is it possible there were enlightened Vikings or Mongols who committed genocide and mass surprise sex? If enlightenment has no meaning in a samsaric context, yeah, we already kind of discussed that. I mean, obviously it has meaning. All meaning is samsaric. Any meaning is samsaric. Meaning is samsara, you could say. The actions of the body just do what it does, and this would be a strange combination. Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, there are cases like tantric sages like Padmasambhava would be a good example. Neem Karoli Baba up there would be another possible example of a kind of enlightened person who is not completely saintly. They behave in ways that are considered inappropriate from a Theravada Buddhist point of view. But still, even Padmasambhava, they wouldn't be like slaughtering monks at monasteries and plundering all the gold and the treasures, stealing treasures, that kind of thing. They just would have outgrown that sort of thing, it would seem to me. But if you go with certain Mahayana points of view, we're all enlightened. Eckhart Tolle kind of says something similar too. It's like we're all enlightened. It's just that for most of us, our mind is making so much noise that we're distracted by that and don't notice. That kind of thing. So from like the point of view of some Mahayana Buddhists, you would say that Vikings and Mongols, Viking berserkers, not just the peaceful ones that stay at home and catch fish and grow barley, but like the berserkers out there slaughtering Irish monks, that kind of thing. Or the Mongols, who are notorious for just being completely ruthless, like no compassion whatsoever, except maybe, just maybe for their own people. Yeah, some Mahayana philosophers would say that even they have the Buddha nature and deep down are essentially enlightened, but it's like this illusory unenlightenment that's masking the true enlightenment, that kind of thing. But just going with samsaric common sense, where you've got wiser people and more foolish people, than the people that are like hacking farmers to death with battle axes, that kind of thing, they tend to be down towards the more foolish end as a general rule. I won't say that it's absolutely impossible. Pretty much anything is possible. Like David Hume said, anything that can be imagined is possible, at least in a metaphysical sense. So, the main thing that I would disagree with in this question is that enlightenment has no meaning in a samsaric context. The only meaning enlightenment has is in a samsaric context. But I'm just saying that, within the scope of samsara, you can have wiser people and more foolish people, but can you have someone who has completely transcended samsara that's still in samsara physically? Is it possible to completely, absolutely eliminate all greed, hate, and delusion? It would seem that a certain amount of attraction and aversion would be necessary just to keep stimulus response theory going, so that people are still, even enlightened people are still able to function. So then you had like the Abhidhamma scholars who came up with Kriya Chitta, which is a whole different kind of consciousness that allows enlightened beings to act as though they have desires, but they don't really have them. Although Kriya Chitta is not mentioned anywhere in the suttas. But did I answer the question? That is the question. So is it possible that there were enlightened Vikings or Mongols who committed genocide and mass surprise sex? And you could say it's possible, at least in a metaphysical sense, but it's hard to imagine unless you've got a really unorthodox interpretation of enlightenment. You're like completely tantric in your understanding of how enlightenment works, then maybe. But from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, it's just no, there's no way. A fully enlightened being can't even pilfer something worth a penny. They can't tell the slightest lie. So they're certainly not going to be slaughtering Irish monks or destroying entire cities, just wiping entire cities off the face of the earth killing most of the people, saving a few that may be useful as slaves or ransom. Anyways, we're dealing in the realm of hypotheticals, I think, here. And it's time to move on to Seal of Action Sipad Zirna's second question. And this is kind of an interesting one. This one might actually get closer to people's lived experiences. He says, what are the thoughts of Burmese monks and people on different traditions like Theravada from other countries, Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, etc.? Well, it's kind of interesting that Burmese monks, a lot of them don't even know that the Thais are Theravada Buddhists. They kind of think that only Burmese Buddhism, plus maybe Sri Lanka, are real Theravada. They think a lot of Burmese people, even though they understand Theravada Buddhism fairly well, still they think the Thais are Mahayana Buddhists. A lot of them do. And so it's kind of interesting that one time I was at a Sri Lankan monastery in California, and one of the ladies there, a Sinhalese lady, was surprised that the Burmese are Theravada Buddhists and not Mahayana Buddhists. You know, it's just sort of, you assume that these foreigners have wrong view. Which, I mean, pretty much everybody has wrong view. But what is the attitudes of Burmese monks with regard to Mahayana Buddhism? I mean, they think, well, at least it's Buddhism. You know, it's gone off the tracks somewhat. You know, it's like a train that's gone off the tracks, but at least it's still a train. So, yeah, I mean, they don't talk about it much. They don't really understand it much. I mean, the Burmese are very hard-headed, and they're focused on, you know, their tradition, Theravada tradition, which they consider the Burmese to have like a monopoly on right view. Maybe the Sri Lankans, maybe. And so they really don't know what Mahayana Buddhism is about, much less Hinduism or Taoism. You know, Islam, they kind of have a little bit of a sort of stereotype of what Islam is all about. And some of the people, you know, they have some understanding of Christianity. You know, there are a lot of Christian missionaries in Burma, and a lot of, there's a certain generation, like around my generation or a little younger, most of the people in Burma that speak fluent English, especially if they have an American accent, they went to Christian schools. And mainly just for the education. And almost none of them converted to Christianity. But they went to Christian schools to get a good education. And they learned how to speak fluent English with an American accent. So they understand something about Christianity. They don't really believe it. You know, they're just kind of locked in to Theravada Buddhism. With regard to Hinduism, there is a certain amount of Hinduism in Burma. There's a lot of like Indian people of Indian ancestry who are still Hindus. Like in the town of Maymyo, there are a few Hindu temples. One time I was traveling through, it's Mahamyain. It's this big forest. There had to be an armed soldier with us on the bus to guard the bus from bandits as we passed through this forest. And it was mostly like a gravel road. There were some places where the road was completely washed out. The men on the bus had to get out and pull the bus with ropes through the sand where the river had washed out the road, that kind of thing. But I remember towards the beginning of the road, you know, the beginning of the journey through this forest, where it's in one of the last places in Burma where there's supposedly still rhinoceroses, tapirs, tigers, that kind of thing. There was a shrine to Baitano Me, which means Black Vishnu. And that's more or less Hindu, I guess. I mean, Vishnu, his prototype is found in the Pali text, I'm pretty sure, like in the Jagasutta, which is one of the paritas, the protection chants in Theravada Buddhism. There's mention of a deva called Isana, who I have been told is like proto-Vishnu, sort of like Rudra was proto-Shiva. Isana, or whatever the Sanskrit equivalent of Isana would be, was like proto-Vishnu. And he was, I guess he was supposed to be like a brother of Saka, king of gods, and he lived in Tawatimsa heaven. He was one of the leaders of Tawatimsa heaven, although he wasn't the supreme leader. So, I mean, the Burmese, mainly Burmese Buddhists, they got a firm grasp on orthodox Theravada Buddhism, especially Burmese iterations of it. And also, they still follow, to some degree, the so-called Nat cult, which was a kind of polytheism that the Burmese followed before they converted to Buddhism. The Nat cult is, I think it's like 31, maybe it was originally 30 Nats, and then they added Saka, king of gods, as leader of the Nats. And it's kind of interesting, the pre-Buddhist religion of Burma, because the Nats, who are like essentially a kind of deva, were all they were all humans in their previous life, and they all died a violent or unnatural death, which causes them to become what in Burmese is called an asane. And an asane is like a powerful ghost or spirit. If you die of natural causes, you just kind of fade out from old age or sickness, then there's like this smoother transition into the next realm. Whereas if your life force in full vitality is just cut off instantaneously, it causes the subsequent spirit to be more powerful, have more vitality, and in some cases to be scarier and more dangerous. And so all of these Nats, like Lord of the White Horse, Lord of the White Elephant, Min Mahagiri is one of the main Nats. That, I mean, all of them were humans who died some kind of unnatural death in their previous existence, and then became like these deities that were to some degree feared and propitiated by pre-Buddhist Burmese people, and even to the present day by a lot of them. Like U Nu, who was the first prime minister of independent Burma after independence from the British Raj. He was having coconut plantations planted all over the country. And supposedly it was for the economy, cultivating coconut oil and this kind of stuff. But deep down, he was a very devout, believer in Burmese religion. And Min Mahagiri likes coconuts. He died in a fire. He burned to death in his previous existence. And so coconut milk or coconut water is very soothing to him, and he likes it. So in order to get Min Mahagiri on the side of the Burmese nation, U Nu, the prime minister, was planting coconut trees all over the country. Kind of like later on, the military dictatorship was planting castor oil plants all over the country, but that was for a different reason. It was still kind of a supernatural reason. And I'm just completely digressing, and I don't give a shit. But when I was living in Burma, like in the 1990s, early 2000s, the military government was forcing people to plant castor oil plants all over the country. And the name for a castor oil plant is Chetsu bin, or just Chetsu. Bin just means plant. So castor oil plant is Chetsu, or Chetsu, I have to pronounce it correctly, which the Burmese use a lot of name magic, and Chetsu has the initial sounds reversed of Suu Kyi, who was like the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who was like the figurehead of the Burmese democracy movement and all that. So by having a plant planted all over the country that had the initial sounds reversed, Chetsu versus Suu Kyi, it was like neutralizing her influence over the country, which maybe worked fairly well. And I noticed that I'm starting to lag, even though I rebooted the freaking computer. I really am going to have to get a new computer, a stronger computer next year sometime. Yeah, the CPU is up to 49.4%. Maybe if I just don't move around very much and talk slowly. Waving my arms too much is just maxing out the computer's capacity. But getting back to Siavaksha and Sipad Zidana's second question that he asked probably hours ago. Yeah, the Burmese people in general, Burmese Buddhists, they know their tradition and they're just not interested in understanding other traditions very much. I've had people tell me, Hinduism is wrong view because they believe in self. They have self view. They've got atta diti. And, I tried to explain to them that the Hindu self view, the belief in Atman, like in the Upanishads, it's really not that different from the belief in Nibbana among Buddhists. I mean, it's just like this formless void. But that was just a little too subtle. There's nothing really they can grasp when I try and talk that way. It's just they're just not used to it. So, yeah, Taoism, probably most Burmese people have never even heard of it. They wouldn't even know what it is. And so with that, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. After spending half an hour answering a question that Siovakshi and Sipad Zirna didn't even ask. So, Siovakshi and Sipad Zirna's third question. For normies, life keeps getting faster and faster with age, and it feels like only years have passed when it was in fact decades. Is this also true for a monk, or does life for a veteran monk such as yourself feel slowed down like in childhood? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. And I remember I was in like 8th or ninth grade, and Mr. Whittick, no, it wasn't Mr. Whittikin. It was some teacher I had who tried to answer this question or tried to explain this to us. And he was saying that when you're 5 years old, a year is 20% of your entire life thus far. When you're 50 years old, it's only 2% of your life. And so that causes kind of a telescoping of past time and makes it seem like time is going faster. For me, I mean, when I was a monk, I had noticed that the years still went by fast, but the minutes went by slower. And it seems to me that, I mean, when years going by fast, I mean, that's just a matter of perspective. And I think what my 8th or ninth grade teacher was saying, Mr. Whitfield, I think, he's not watching, it doesn't matter. I mean, there is some truth to that, I think. But it's like the subjective experience of the passage of time. I think the more conscious you are, the more slowly it seems to go by. Like, for example, you take some consciousness expanding chemical like LSD, and 5 minutes can seem like it's taking an hour because you're experiencing each moment like in greater detail. It's like you're more aware of each moment, which makes it seem like it's going by slower because you're experiencing it more fully. You're packing in more data, I guess, so that it seems to be going by more slowly. So, yeah, I think probably the years go by faster because I'm getting up there in age. I've got the Deva Dutas, gray hair and wrinkles and a few missing teeth. But the minutes go by more slowly, it seems to me. So it's kind of a trade-off, I guess. But it would seem that the more conscious you are, the more slowly time goes by. Which makes it kind of, I mean, there is the idea, it's attributed to Albert Einstein. He says if you're sitting on a hot stove, a minute seems like an hour, but if you're talking to a pretty girl, an hour seems like a minute. That's relativity. So, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, it does seem like time flies when you're having fun, the old saying that going with my explanation, when you're suffering, you're more conscious than when you're not suffering. But it may be that when you're suffering, there's just kind of more friction, seeming to slow things down. Or you're just kind of aware of the unpleasant stuff. Whereas if you're having fun in an ordinary sense, like the normie kind of fun, so your mind just kind of is accepting everything and just kind of this, I don't know, just kind of you're in a euphoria that allows time to just go by. You're not fully conscious, maybe. I'm not sure. You're going to have to ask a psychologist about that one. Why does time seem to go by faster when you're having fun? That's a good question. But I have noticed back in the day when I was taking those kind of substances, you take, 500 micrograms of LSD and it makes 5 minutes seem like an hour. And we're lagging again. And I don't care anymore. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. I'm sorry, I'm not able to just conclusively once and for all answer some of these questions, because sometimes people ask questions that I've never really considered, or I just don't really know the exact answer. It's especially hypothetical questions about enlightened berserkers. It's you're just in the realm of conjecture at that point, it would seem to me. And two different sages might have two entirely different answers. Like some Burmese Seattle would just say, no, flatly impossible. Whereas maybe some Tibetan monk, he might be more open-minded on the subject. Anyways, I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, do you think the brain creates consciousness, or do you see it as a receiver? And I don't know, it's kind of a trick question. I've answered this question before, that the brain is like a computer, consciousness is like electricity. So a computer doesn't create electricity. It just takes electricity and then complexifies it, organizes it, and utilizes it. So the brain creates mental states, at least within this version of reality, this version of samsara. You can say the brain creates thoughts or mental states, but it's not creating the substance of consciousness itself. I'm of the opinion that consciousness pervades the entire universe. It's just that most of it isn't complexified and organized into mental states. Sort of in theoretical quantum physics, where empty space can contain zero energy or infinite energy. It's kind of like that with consciousness too. You can say empty space contains zero consciousness, but also in a sense, depending on how you do the math, it can contain infinite consciousness. And to a religious person, that might be like the spirit of God pervading the universe, that kind of thing. So yeah, the brain, just going with, our version of empirical samsara, that even then the brain does not create consciousness. And scientists really have no idea how the brain could possibly create consciousness. How do electrochemical reactions going on in neurons generate subjective experience? To this day, scientists don't have a clue. So, it would answer a lot of questions. It would solve the whole brain-body problem and all that if you just accept that what physicists call energy is exactly the same as what a psychologist calls consciousness. It's the same essence. It's just that what a psychologist calls consciousness usually is all complexified by a brain. It's all turned into mental states, because consciousness is just the substance. It's like water, whereas mental states are like the waves. Or going with the computer analogy again, it's like what the computer is doing ultimately is electricity, but it's organizing, it's turning the electricity into usable forms that's then used and utilized, and you wind up with the computer actually accomplishing something. So I guess I answered that one relatively quickly. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Eventual Muse. And I am happy to say that the lag thus far hasn't really exceeded about 1 second. Those of you who just listen to the podcast are lucky, because there seems to be, lately especially, always some kind of a lag between video and audio that comes and goes. It drifts, which, according to Grok, is usually a sign that the computer is maxing out on its CPU capacity. or not really maxing out, but getting so busy that it just can't keep up. Anyways, Eventual Muse says, you've said many times that you really can't judge or speak for enlightened beings. And of great interest is several times you mentioned that village people considered you as enlightened, inferring that they got you wrong. So my question, and I'm mostly serious here, how can you be sure that you are not enlightened? And I mean, I've never really flatly denied being enlightened, just because I don't want to like shut the door on myself. Because I mean, you've got like the Mahayana Buddhists and Eckhart Tolle and those people who are saying everyone's already enlightened. So if somebody, back when I was a monk especially, asked me, are you enlightened? I mean, nobody asks me that now anymore, really, except for Eventual Muse here. But it used to be, if someone asked me if I was enlightened, I'd say, if I'm enlightened, so are you. If you're not enlightened, neither am I. That would generally be my standard answer to that question. So in a sense, you could say everybody's enlightened or nobody is. You know, it's sort of like either everybody's perfect or nobody is, that kind of thing. So how can I be sure that I'm not enlightened? Well, I mean, especially those of you who have a mate, most of you guys are males. And so if you've got a woman in your life, you may know that women seem to specialize in pushing buttons. And it's like almost the only time I ever raise my voice is when I'm just getting exasperated by, some kind of, female. I don't even know how to say it. Pushing my buttons. So, I mean, it's fairly evident to me that I still have preferences. I still have, better days and worse days, that kind of thing. I still have attractions and aversions. I mean, they may be more subtle than the average person has, but, it's still there. I'm still human. So, I mean, from the Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, I couldn't possibly be enlightened because, I don't even have perfect sila. But like from the Mahayana Buddhist point of view, Eckhart Tolle, that kind of thing, then the enlightenment is there, but it's sort of covered over by an illusion that isn't really there. And I think I have a little more insight into that aspect of what enlightenment kind of is considered to be than most people. I'm maybe a little bit less opaque than most people, although I'm not really trying to compare myself with others. It's not like any kind of contest. But 30 years as a monk, a conscientiously practicing monk, it does have its fruits. It does have its good results, maybe I should say. Plus, you have to have enough wisdom or insight or clarity to even want to become a monk in the first place. So, I'm not sure that I'm not enlightened because, you've got people like Eckhart Tolle and the Mahayana Buddhists saying everybody's enlightened. But from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who is fully enlightened. So, I'm just going to move on to Eventual Muse's next question. He says, or she says, probably he, just going with statistics. Most of my viewers are male, like more than 95% of them. Eventual Muse says, help me understand how it is that many seek, desire, and work ceaselessly to become streamlined enterers. I think Eventual Muse means stream enterers, sotapannas. But the very desire of wanting this negates the entire idea of letting go desires in obtaining enlightenment. How do we square these conflicting narratives? This is a common question. And first of all, a stream enterer is like the lowest level of Buddhist sainthood, going with Orthodox Theravada. And so they still have desires anyway. But I mean, the standard question is, how can you strive for enlightenment? How can you desire enlightenment and become enlightened? And the question I pretty much always give is, it's like you become motivated for enlightenment. Enlightenment, the desire for enlightenment replaces all your other desires. You renounce the world. You renounce worldly life and you dedicate your life to enlightenment. That is your last major attachment. You are attached to the idea of becoming enlightened, and you strive and you strive and you strive. You purify yourself, you practice hard, and you fail because you still have this obstacle of this desire for enlightenment, this one last attachment, until finally it's like in despair, you just let go. In a way, it's like surrender. It's almost like giving up. And it's like this, when you hit this wall of despair and just let go, it's like you can't, it's like you're beating your head against this brick wall. Finally, you just stop. And it's like your last attachment, all of your desires and attachments kind of coalesce into this one big one for desire or for enlightenment. And then when you just let that last one go, click, poof, whatever. So it's skillful means, it's the raft made of rubbish. Let's see. Did I answer the question sufficiently for me to move on to the next one? The very desire of wanting this negates the entire idea of letting go desires and obtaining enlightenment. They become more and more subtle. It's skillful means. In a way, there's a certain sutta about dismissing unwanted thoughts. And one way of doing it is you replace one unskillful thought with a more subtle, more skillful thought. The way a carpenter will drive a peg or a dowel out of a plank of wood with a smaller piece of wood. And then once the bigger piece is driven out with the smaller piece, you toss both of them away. And using a desire for enlightenment as kind of a replacement for all the other unenlightened desires of sex, drugs, and rock and roll and ice cream and pizza and all that. You replace it all with a more wholesome, more subtle kind of desire or attachment. And then, you get as far as you can get with that, but eventually you have to let that go also. And that was something that the Burmese really had difficulty wrapping their head around. They seem to think that at the moment of enlightenment, the desires fall away. Whereas it's like you can't really become enlightened until the desires fall away. They just think that, you're not going to be, perfectly saintly until after you become enlightened. But really, it's like you got to be damn near perfect before you become enlightened, it seems to me, unless there's just some radical transformation happens. But that's an entirely different issue. So yeah, it's skillful means. It's just a way of getting closer to the goal. But eventually you have to let that go too. And so I'm just going to move on to Eventual Muse's third question. He says, do you think a case could be made that cows and dogs are enlightened, as I'm sure they do not live lives with a massive desire to become enlightened? Well, Eckhart Tolle in his first famous book says that all animals are essentially enlightened, except for a few domesticated ones that have inherited neurotic symptoms, unenlightenment from their masters. So you might have some yappy Shih Tzu or something, some little Maltese that isn't enlightened just because it has become neurotic from its interaction with humans. That's what Eckhart Tolle says. From the Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, animals are in a lower realm. They're not enlightened. I mean, Eckhart Tolle's argument is that animals are fully in the present moment. They're not worrying about the future. They're not regretting the past. Be here now, the power of now. And so Eckhart Tolle says that because animals are fully in the present moment, Walt Whitman said similar stuff in Leaves of Grass, if any of you are into poetry that has no meter or rhyme. But I mean, there's more to enlightenment than just being in the present moment. It seems to me, going from the Buddhist point of view, they're still delusional. Even though they're not worried about the future, they're not regretting the past, they're not wondering what's going on in some other part of the world. They're not really worried about what some other animal thinks of them, that kind of thing. They're just be here now, but still they're delusional. They think that this is reality. For example, they still have desires and fears. They're like most wild animals, it would seem, are motivated by fear and hunger. Those would be the two main ones. And so from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, animals really are kind of in a kind of lower realm. And a similar argument could be used for like human babies. Some people think a human baby could be like fully enlightened. And, there's like Wordsworth wrote Intimations of Immortality, this ode. It's one of his more famous poems. He's considered one of the giants of English literature, even though probably most people don't know who Wordsworth was. Nobody's read any Wordsworth lately. He wrote this Intimations of Immortality about how small children are actually closer to enlightenment or closer to God than adults are. And there is some truth to that. I mean, humans, we've got this burden of concepts that animals and like small children really don't have. It's like an adult sees a dandelion and it's just like weed. It's just, you just label it as dandelion or weed. You just slap the label on it as soon as you recognize what it is, and that's it. You don't take in any of the fine details, anything like that. Or to a little kid, that dandelion could be a pretty flower, and they're just like, in awe of the miracle of this pretty flower they're holding in their hand. Because they haven't learned these knee-jerk, like, reflexes practically. It's just a weed, just once you've labeled it, and just determine that it's useless, you just ignore it and move on to the next thing. But animals, yeah, I really don't think that animals are fully enlightened. If you get down to something that really doesn't even have perception, so it doesn't even have delusion, like a tapeworm, maybe I shouldn't have picked a parasite, but still a tapeworm, it's got no brain. It maybe has like unrefined consciousness. Like I was saying earlier, consciousness can pervade the entire universe, but it's not like taking that consciousness and like mutating it into mental states that then kind of become the substance of like delusion and unenlightenment. So yeah, maybe like plants could be enlightened in a sense, or some animal that's so primitive that it doesn't even have a mind, no mental states anyway. Those maybe you could say are enlightened, just like you could say like rocks and bricks are enlightened. They have no greed, hate, or delusion. They could have a kind of unrefined primordial consciousness pervading them, but they have no greed, hate, or delusion. But even a cow or a dog, I mean, they still have attraction and aversion and delusion, it seems to me. So the way Ram Dass, in one of his early books, described it is like you start off, it's like you imagine a clock, an old fashioned with those hands. And so it's like midnight is union with God. And then it's like when you get to 1 minute past 12, you're starting to create this being that is like delusional and like separated from God, at least in their own mind. In reality, they aren't, but in their own mind, it's like they've come up with these mental states that have sort of identified with themselves, consider themselves to be like closed off. It started like this spiritual journey. I don't like using the word journey, but it's kind of started the unenlightened being's progression. And so for the first half, all the way down to 6 o'clock, they're getting farther and farther away from enlightenment, or farther and farther away from ultimate reality or God. And then once you get to like 1 minute past 6, they start moving back up towards, God o'clock at 12. And so animals might be, in a sense, closer to enlightenment than us. Like a cow, for example. I mean, they keep 5 precepts perfectly. They don't lie. They don't steal. They don't kill on purpose. I mean, they might eat grass that's got a snail on it or something. They only have sex to reproduce. You don't have slutty female cows with plastic udder implants and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, in a way, they have less delusion than we do, just because they have less mind to work with. You have less mental states. But you've got to get farther and farther away until you've reached the maximum distance before you start coming back the other way, closer and closer to God again. So you got to do the full circle. Just because some animals only at 1 o'clock, whereas a human might be at 7, technically they're closer to the absolute than a human being is. But in order for them to reach that absolute, they're going to have to go all the way around, all the way around to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way back up to 12 again. That's not really how Theravada Buddhist describes it, but that's how Ram Dass described it, along more Hinduistic lines in one of his early books. But from the Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, animals are in a lower realm. They're much worse off than we are. And it seems to me that's pretty much right. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Crake-Ass Mofo. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Must be French. So Crake-Ass Mofo says, do you no longer follow the path of the Buddha? And I no longer follow the path of the Buddha along monastic lines. In fact, I don't even follow perfectly the path of the Buddha for lay people. So, I mean, I still consider Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist ethics to be essentially correct. Although, I mean, I do allow myself the privilege of critical thought. I am skeptical with regard to a lot of it. I have much more regard for somebody like J. Krishnamurti than any self-respecting Theravada Buddhist should have. But I'm more Buddhist than anything else. So this kind of leads up to Crake-Ass Mofo's second question. He says, isn't your claim that you cannot change, that you are who you are, in complete opposition to the teaching of the Buddha? For example, you claim if you are an angry person, something like that you said, then you cannot change. Seems to contradict everything the Buddha taught about the self, about following his teachings to change into a more peaceful, compassionate, calm-minded person. Well, Crake-Ass Mofo wasn't really paying very close attention to what I was saying in the previous Q&A. I mean, I went through a lot of detail about how it takes, like talking about Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, about how it really takes a kind of crisis to knock somebody out of a rut, that changing is difficult. I never said it was impossible, that it doesn't happen. But for the average person, statistically, it's unlikely. That as a general rule, people don't change unless your perception changes. Like I was also mentioning Schopenhauer's The Fourfold Root of Sufficient Reason towards the beginning of the comments I was making that Crake-Ass Mofo is responding to here. So, I mean, from the very beginning of that discussion in the previous Q&A, I was talking about how it does happen, it can happen, because like from Schopenhauer's point of view, the only way you can change your behavior is to change your perceptions. And like William Sargent says in his book Battle for the Mind, as a general rule, we are governed by habit. We just cling to these habits. We are attached to these habits. And that's kind of the way karma is. It's like habit energy. the force of habit that lets us run on autopilot through most of our lives. And the only way to really change that is through some kind of crisis, some kind of emotional breakdown. And I was talking about how John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, used this. I mentioned all that in the previous Q&A. I don't know why Crake-Ass Mofo just took out this one bit of that discussion and thought that that was all I said about the issue. So never did I say that you cannot change. But what is necessary is you have to change the way you think. And as a general rule, we resist that. And so for a lot of people, it takes some kind of crisis to just jolt or slam us out of this habitual rut that we are in. And that can happen accidentally, like most Western people who claim to be enlightened or are claimed to be enlightened usually get to their state accidentally through a near-death experience or some existential crisis that they weren't planning on, they weren't cultivating, it just happened to them. Ramana Maharshi, another case in point, it happened to him accidentally. In Buddhism, you're doing it deliberately, but most Buddhists go about it in such a comfortable way that they don't really trigger the crisis. In the Buddhist time, you've got someone who just renounces the world, just radical renunciation. They're wandering around homeless, living in tiger and bandit-infested jungles, this kind of stuff. The crisis can happen pretty easily. But if you're just hanging out in like this comfortable monastery, knowing where your next meal is coming from, knowing where you're going to sleep that night, as a general rule, things are so easy and peaceful, you just don't hit the crisis point. Unless you are striving with all your might to become enlightened or whatever, to attain this ideal, you can't do it. And then you have like the crisis of, I can't do it. And then you just kind of let go. That's something I was mentioning a little earlier. So, yeah, people do change. They can change. But most people, because either they're unwilling to do what is necessary, or they just don't have it happen to them through some near-death experience or some such, it's sort of like, the fat lady on the diet that just struggles and can't lose weight, or she'll start to lose weight and then gain it all back again. Or someone who tries to quit smoking and, it's like they quit and then start and quit and start. Or, they try to, they're an alcoholic or something. And most of these people, they'll try and try and try. And they just, they're not wholehearted about it in many cases. Or, they just don't take it seriously enough to get to that point of like the breakdown or the crisis that just can allow them to really make significant change. Like Ram Dass said in one of his early books that I read, and it haunted me for most of my life, that like absolute despair is a prerequisite for significant spiritual growth. For many years, I hoped that he was wrong, but it seems that he probably was right. Like in my life, I've gone through at least 2 sort of spiritual growth spurts, and both of them were the result of despair. So I never said that you cannot change. I'm just saying that for the average person, it is statistically unlikely that it takes more than most people are willing to invest for the sake of changing. And a lot of people, they just think you can just change. You should just be different. It's like people can judge others really easily. It's like, why don't they just be different? I used to think that way about like really obese people, where it's like, man, why don't they just, all you got to do is just eat less, maybe get a little more exercise. And then it was like, you have your own attachments. And when you're struggling with that, then after like decades of trying to change yourself and having limited success, then you have more compassion for other people who aren't even trying as hard or just don't know how to go about it. Because as a general rule, we are stuck being who we are, mainly because we prefer to be stuck being who we are. It's just, we're just creatures of habit, and we just cling to these habits and resist change until our habits just aren't working anymore, which is the crisis. Okay. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. See how we're doing here. Not too bad, I guess. Been going for an hour. CPU is at 42%. Next question is from Dripwalker. And Dripwalker says, can you consider the natural state of the mind to be nipapancha? And nipapancha literally means something like non-proliferation, non-differentiation, which is a synonym for nirvana. So do I consider the natural state of the mind to be nipapancha? I consider the natural state of consciousness to be nipapancha. I mean, most consciousness, assuming that the universe is pervaded by it, that even a hydrogen atom has like this little primordial spark of consciousness to it, then yeah, all of that would be nipapancha or nirvana, enlightenment, whatever. It's only when you get into like a delusional mind, a delusional mental state that you get perceptions and volitions, then you get papancha. That's what perceptions do. They differentiate. They proliferate. So enlightenment or nirvana, going with the term nipapancha, is just non-differentiation. When you start dividing the universe up into parts, you're in delusional samsara. So the natural state of just consciousness is nipapancha. The natural state of perception or mental states is papancha or illusion or unenlightenment, delusion. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what Dripwalker had in mind with regard to the mind. Does he mean consciousness or does he mean mental states? I think most people would equate mind with mental states. Although, personally, there's a deeper level of mind than mental states, which is just consciousness itself, which is like the essence of the mental states. So consciousness is essence, and mental states are form, the forms that consciousness takes. Kind of like this cup. Is it ceramic or is it a mug? I guess it's more of a mug than a cup. So which is it? Is it ceramic or is it a mug? Well, it's both. The essence is ceramic, and the form, the function, is mug. Holding my coffee, which is now lukewarm coffee, but that's all right. We're still going through a kind of heat wave in upstate South Carolina. So, I guess I answered that question. And so I'm going to move on to Dripwalker's second question. He says, the house on fire, is the goal to put out the fire rather than getting out of the house, if you know what I mean? Well, he's referring to is the traditional Buddhist metaphor. It's, I think, probably the most famous version of the house on fire is from the Lotus Sutra, which is a Mahayana text. Although the Buddha's third discourse after his enlightenment, according to tradition, was the fire sermon, where he's saying, the universe is on fire, the world is on fire. The fires of greed, hate, and delusion. So, just going with the metaphor, we're trapped in a burning building. And so, the Buddhist answer is you get out of the building. Part of the analogy or the metaphor is, putting out the fire really isn't an option. One person can't just cure samsara for everybody else. So that's one reason why it's escaping from the building rather than putting out the fire, because you put out the fire, all the beings in the universe are now safe No more suffering, no more greed, hate, and delusion. And it doesn't work that way. All you can do is save yourself. So it could be that a better analogy than putting out the fire or even escaping the burning building would be to become fireproof. That would do it. An enlightened being, they're still kind of in the burning building. It's just they don't get burned anymore. They're like flame retardant. They're fireproof. So I think that might be a better analogy than putting out the fire. But yeah, it's like an enlightened being still is kind of in the burning building. Or just like going with Plato's cave analogy, where, the enlightened being is, first they get loose from being chained up facing the wall and thinking that the flickering shadows are reality. The first stage of their enlightenment might be just the awareness that they're chained up. Then they get loose, but they're still kind of in the dark cave, the flickering shadows and everything. Then they go outside the cave. That's kind of escaping from the burning building. But then, sort of like the enlightened being, they come back in and try to help others. So, they're escaping the fire, escaping the burning building. I think just becoming flame-proof. But then again, part of the analogy is that, like, if you're trapped in a burning building, and, it's better, if you want to help others, first you got to find a way out of that burning building. Then if you think it is appropriate, you can come back into the burning building and rescue others by showing them the way out. But there are a lot of people who they just think that staying in the burning building and applying first aid to the burn victims is the moral thing to do. Whereas from the Buddhist point of view, you find a way out, and then maybe you come back in and you help rescue other people. Although in reality, most people don't know the building's on fire, don't want to be rescued, just think that you're a nut. Sort of like the people that are still chained up in Plato's cave. You got the person who's like sort of dazzled by the bright sun for the first time in his life. He comes back into the cave and he's going to seem just like disoriented and just kind of stupid to the people that are still chained up in there. Most people don't want to be enlightened. Most people do not want to escape from samsara or to transcend samsara. They like it. In fact, that's why we're here. As a general rule, we're not unenlightened because we don't try hard enough to become enlightened. We're unenlightened because we just want to be unenlightened. Partly just because don't know any better, as a general rule, or just force of habit. Anyways, with that, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Practice Metta. And Practice Metta says, I'm wondering how one knows whether a particular monastery is truly the right place to ordain. In my case, I've already visited several temples in Thailand. I found one that felt intuitively right and asked to ordain there, but they weren't set up to ordain foreigners and redirected me elsewhere. Since then, I've been thinking about continuing to go from temple to temple, hoping for a clear lightning bolt moment of certainty that tells me this is exactly where I belong, but I'm wondering if this is a foolish way to go about it. Would it be wiser to simply pick a suitable monastery, even if it doesn't feel perfect, and allow the path to unfold from there? You mentioned that you just went to your local monastery and everything worked out well for you. At the same time, it seemed like you might not recommend that same straightforward approach for someone else. Is that correct? Well, first of all, I'll mention this last paragraph here. It wasn't a local monastery. There were no Theravada Buddhist monasteries in Washington state at that time that I'm aware of. I had to go to California. It was the only Theravada Buddhist monastery I even really knew of in the United States. Wat Metta hadn't started yet. The Ajahn Chah places hadn't started yet. There was Tampulu Kabe Monastery in Boulder Creek, California. I found out about a couple other places. There was Bawana Society over like in West Virginia or something like that. So I just went to the only place I really knew of. At the time, could have very well been the best forest monastery in a Theravada Buddhist tradition in the United States. It might have been at the time. Like I said, this is back before Wat Metta or Abhayagiri or any place like that. So I went there and was ordained there. I mean, it was pretty much the obvious choice. It was pretty much the only place I knew of that I had been to and looked at. And I mean, it didn't really go all that well. It was one of the monastery attendants referred to the place as a shit accelerator. It's like you go to a spiritual place like an ashram or a monastery, and everyone is like restrained. Everyone can't just act as they please the way they would, they can act as they please to a less degree than if you're out in the world, living a worldly life. You're more restrained through moral restraint and all that. And so it like accelerates neurosis and just shit. So, yeah, it didn't go very well. And at the time that I left Tampulu Kaba'a Monastery, it was just, the Burmese people were in open rebellion against the board of directors. They're trying to just take control of the monastery, regardless of who owns the deed of the property and all that. So it was like this uproar going on. You had a German nun there with just a classic textbook case of schizophrenia who was causing all kinds of just havoc, wreaking havoc. It's just the place was just, it was a shitstorm going on at the time that I left. And the monks really weren't practicing very hard. They weren't following the rules of monastic discipline. It was just kind of like easygoing Burmese cultural center kind of an atmosphere. So, yeah, it didn't work all that well for me, although in the long run, it worked out okay. But let's get up higher up on this scroll here with regard to this question. Let's see. Been thinking, continue going from temple to temple, hoping for a clear lightning bolt moment. Well, this reminds me of a Vietnamese monk I met in Burma. I was senior monk at One Bo Wildlife Refuge Monastery, One Bo Bemet Do Jaon in northwestern Burma. And this Vietnamese monk showed up. And he was just, he had like this phobia of lay people. Like he'd be sitting out in front of his cave, eating his meal. A layperson would come to pay respects. He would just abandon his food, go into the cave and hide for the whole rest of the day. His food would just be baking in the sun, for hours because he was just terrified of having to deal with lay people. And he was extremely fussy. He was kind of eccentric. Let's just put it that way. And he had been in Burma for less than a year. He'd already been to more places than I had been to in 10 years. And he's just, where is a good place? Where is a good place? And I told him, it's like, if you have been to that many places already and still haven't found a suitable place, it may be the problem is not with the places, but with your own mental states. Because he had been to pretty much every reputable monastery in Burma, at least the well-known ones, and always finding something wrong with each place, never finding a place that he really considered to be satisfactory, but he was just relentlessly driven to just go from one place to the next in search of a perfection that he was never going to find because his own mind wasn't perfect. So I think, if you haven't found a place that just clicks as this is the right place, it just feels completely right. You may have to go with the idea of the first noble truth, everything is dukkha. No place is going to be completely satisfactory. And, just find a place where at least you've got an abbot who, is a good teacher, has some wisdom, where the monks are actually practicing following the rules of monastic discipline. That was another problem for me, is my own abbot or my own preceptor, who was the abbot, didn't particularly even like me. He didn't like foreigners in general. He didn't like Westerners as a general rule because we just weren't Burmese enough. So, yeah, I mean, just if you cannot find the place that just feels intuitively like this is the place, then just find a place where at least you've got a wise, good teacher who is willing to ordain you, and where, there's some discipline, some genuine practice going on there, and then just take it from there. It may be that you'll just kind of settle in and it will become the right place. Or, I mean, at the very least, you've got a good start. At least you're starting with a strict tradition and a wise teacher and all that. And then maybe a few years down the road, it may be appropriate to go somewhere else. But if you can't find the perfect place, then go for a place that isn't perfect, but at least kind of fits the requisites for a place where you'd want to ordain. I mean, you don't want to be ordained at some sloppy monastery where the monks aren't practicing. If you've got like a preceptor who will be your teacher, who really is like a meditation master, then that's excellent. You're already way ahead of the game. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, in your last Q&A, number 202, the first question you addressed was about some overlap between Buddhism and Taoism. One of the concepts in Taoism that I think is on the mark is the idea of yin and yang, that there exists a kind of cosmic balance of opposite but complementary forces in the world. Yin, the more passive and receptive, and more traditionally feminine energy, and yang, the active and more traditionally masculine energy. Does Buddhism encompass or address, the existence of the concepts of yin and yang or something similar? And I've discussed this before. There really is nothing like clearly mirroring the idea of yin and yang in Theravada Buddhism. It's mainly Theravada that I'm familiar with. I'm most familiar with Theravada. And there's nothing that's central to Buddhist philosophy in like orthodox tradition that compares to yin and yang. Probably the closest is the Lokadhamma. It's like five pairs of opposites, like praise and blame, success and failure, that kind of thing, where you're going to be encountering, like both in a more or less equal measure. Lokadhamma, you can look that up. Lokadhamma. So that's pretty much the closest you get to like a Taoist idea of yin and yang in Orthodox Theravada. But it seems to me that yin and yang dependently co-arise. That's why they exist in the world. It's like, according to the Tao Te Ching, from the Tao you have the one, from the one you have the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. So yin and yang are sort of like the two that gives birth to the entire universe of duality. And I mean, that's dependent co-arising, at least from my understanding of it. In Orthodox Theravada, dependent co-arising kind of ossified into the 12 Nidana theory, where this leads to this, leads to this. It's sort of like this chain of cause and effect that keeps us trapped in samsara. But it seems to me that the Buddha really didn't teach dependent co-arising as these 12 links. That was just caused by people not really understanding dependent co-arising. It was just too abstract or something. And according to legend, the Buddha almost didn't teach Buddhism right after his enlightenment because he figured nobody was going to understand dependent co-arising, and he was pretty much correct. So I do think that dependent co-arising, in a way, I mean, it accounts for dualism, which would include yin and yang. I mean, opposites like dependently co-arise. You can't have positive without negative. You can't have inhaling without exhaling. They dependently co-arise. It's like this duality, this like dualistic pair of opposites. I mean, they support each other. It's sort of like the particle and the antiparticle coming out of empty space in quantum physics. Out of nothing, you get the particle and the antiparticle, which usually come back together and annihilate each other, and then you're back to zero again. But that's more along the lines of how I interpret dependent co-arising or paticca samuppada, the whole 12 nidana thing. I mean, the evidence really doesn't support it very well, in my opinion. Possibly my greatest contribution academically to Buddhistic studies is my theory of like how the 12 nidana theory arose as the standard orthodox explanation for paticca samuppada or dependent co-arising. But I think originally, it's this arising, that arises, this being, that is, this cease, or this not being, that is not, and this ceasing, that ceases. That's like the simple formula of dependent co-arising that you can find in the suttas. But again, it's sort of like how dualism arises. It's like pairs of opposites, like the particle and the antiparticle, they dependently co-arise. You can't just have the antiparticle appear without the particle balancing it out and maintaining everything at the same zero. So originally, it may be that dependent co-arising could have accounted for yin and yang, could have included a kind of yin and yang sort of idea in early Buddhist philosophy, but apparently, going with my theory, it was abandoned because it wasn't really understood, and you wind up with this 12 links that is kind of just sort of inserted into sutta after sutta, the same verbatim block of words for dependent co-arising, and Buddhist monks like in Burma will memorize the 12 links and think they understand dependent co-arising, when the Buddha more wisely assumed nobody was going to understand dependent co-arising. So within traditional Orthodox Theravada, probably the 10 Lokadhammas are about as close as you're going to get to yin and yang, but I do think originally dependent co-arising had a kind of yin and yang energy to it, so to speak. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is what also from Romeo, and I think I may have already answered this one, because Romeo says, regardless of what Buddhism says about the existence of yin and yang, what is your take on the existence of yin and yang? And it's, pairs of opposites in a dualistic samsara. That samsara is based on dualism. You can't have beauty without ugliness. You can't have good without bad. You can't have bad without good. I mean, if you somehow eliminated all ugliness from the world, which isn't going to happen, but if you somehow eliminated all ugliness, like just the concept of ugliness disappears, the concept of beauty, that concept is going to disappear also. Without ugliness, beauty has no meaning. Without badness, goodness has no meaning. So it's essentially dualism, which is from the two came the 10,000 things. And I hope that's a good enough explanation in addition to the long-winded kind of explanation I gave to the previous question. Just yin and yang as like, the flag of South Korea has that on it. I think it's more complex or more subtle than that. It's not just, sort of masculine active element and feminine passive element. I think, it's just any pairs of opposites would fit yin and yang. It maybe they just, for whatever reason, they chose that particular version of a dualistic pair of opposites to help explain why the universe is the way it is. Sort of like in physics, you've got positive and negative, positive particles or antiparticles, or even the atom has like the positive proton balanced out by the negative electrons, this kind of thing. It's just all through empirical reality that you have to have this kind of paired opposites. And either yin and yang in Taoism represents that in general, or if they just singled out one particular pair of opposites as a kind of cosmic, sort of a cosmic balance kind of thing. So, with regard to the orthodox Taoist yin and yang, that's kind of a metaphor in a sense. Whereas I do think it's quite, it's quite valid that this world of samsara is based on dualism. Just to perceive anything, you have to have the dualism of figure and ground. At the very least, you have to have that much. And then all the value judgments of good and bad, beautiful and ugly, all that gets thrown in also. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And Ethiopian Fake Tig says, can you perhaps point out the problem in this Hindu conversation? It's trying to solidify the concept of an Atman. So the student says, it is a matter of daily experience that on waking up, the world suddenly appears. Where does it come from? Then Maharaj says, before anything can come into being, there must be somebody to whom it comes. All appearance and disappearance presupposes a change against some changeless background. Then the student says, before waking up, I was unconscious. Then Maharaj says, in what sense? Having forgotten or not having experienced? Don't you experience even when unconscious? Can you exist without knowing? A lapse in memory, is it a proof of non-existence? And can you validly talk about your own non-existence as an actual experience? You cannot even say that your mind did not exist. Did you not wake up on being called? And on waking up, was it not the sense I am that came first? Some seed of consciousness must be existing even during sleep or swoon. On waking up, the experience runs, I am the body in the world. It may appear to arise in succession, but in fact it is all simultaneous, a single idea of having a body in a world. Can there be the sense of I am without being somebody or other? Okay, so Ethiopian Fake Tig asks, can I perhaps point out the problem in this Hindu conversation? Well, first of all, there's a few things here. The Hindu Swami is called Maharaj. I don't know if that's Nisargadatta Maharaj or some other Maharaj. Maharaj is like Maharaji up there. Maharaj is a very common title for some sort of spiritual teacher in India. It just means great king. According to Ram Dass, even like barbers can be called Maharaj. Just anybody you want to like brown nose, anyone you're being really polite to, you can call them Maharaj. So it's not necessarily Nisargadatta Maharaj. But another thing I would point out is that this Maharaj is correct, that even when you're in a deep sleep, you're still conscious. Otherwise, nobody would be able to wake you up. You wouldn't hear the alarm clock. You wouldn't feel somebody shaking you. You wouldn't hear somebody calling out your name. You wouldn't feel somebody sluicing you down with a bucket of ice water. You'd be like in a coma. So even dreamless sleep is still a kind of consciousness. But let's just get to the actual question here. What is the problem in this Hindu conversation? It's not really a problem, it seems to me. He says that there has to be some sort of, there has to be a subject for an object, is essentially what he's saying, which reminds me of the Sin Sin Ming, attributed to the third Chinese patriarch of Zen Buddhism, who says in the Sin Sin Ming, the subject is a subject for the object is an object for the subject. Again, it's duality, dependent co-arising. Subject and object arise simultaneously and depend upon each other for their existence. They cannot exist independently. To have a subject, there must be an object. To have an object, there must be a subject. So, that seems to fit what Maharaj here is talking about. It's not implying there has to be a pre-existent self or Atman. It just means that for there to be any awareness of any object, a subject has to arise at the same time or be present at the same time. But, you get rid of the object and the subject disappears also. It's just that Maharaj is saying that when you're in a deep sleep, there's still going to be a subject. And it may be that he's not implying that there has to be an object too, but you can't have one without the other. You have to, it's sort of like in Theravada Buddhism where it's talking about consciousness. In Theravada Buddhism, like Vijnana Khanda, the aggregate of consciousness, it always has to be consciousness of something. That the object and the consciousness have to arise simultaneously. So let's see here. Where is the problem that Ethiopian fake Tig says exists here? See, before anything can come into being, there must be somebody to whom it comes. Well, that's not necessarily true. Because the somebody to whom it comes doesn't have to exist before anything can come to being. They arise simultaneously. Subject and object dependently co-arise. So I guess that could be seen as a problem where Maharaj here is implying that there has to be an Atman first before anything arises, where actually, from a more Buddhistic point of view, subject and object arise simultaneously. So let's see here. Having forgotten or not having experienced, don't you experience even when unconscious? Yeah, so he seems to be agreeing with me there. Can you exist without knowing? Yeah, so it seems to me that it may be because he's a Hindu, he is assuming that there is a pre-existent Atman, but the arguments he's using seem to support the idea, at least equally as well as his own theory, that subject and object dependently co-arise. And so, if there's no object, there's no subject, and if there's no subject, there's no object. I guess that is the problem that I'm supposed to point out. So I guess I did that. And so I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian fake Tig's next question. He says, you once said, since there is no free will in Buddhism, and that people aren't even in control of their volition as well, if all this is true and there also is no self, and karma is a collection of energies, and it's the karma that is truly real, then what the heck is karma really? Someone once said, the only real thing is consciousness, since everything that is only can appear in everything that is only can appear in consciousness, but karma seems to be the only real thing in Buddhism when you strip away everything else that is an illusion. Well, in Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, karma is real because volition is real. There's a few things I can mention here. Let's see. He says, there is no free will in Buddhism. It seems to be ruled out, like in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, considered to be the Buddha's second formal discourse after his enlightenment. He points out that with regard to all of the five khandhas, including volition, including, which one is it? Sankhara Khanda. You cannot say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and have it reliably happen. He's not saying that you don't have he's not saying that you don't have any free will at all. It's like with regard to like Rupa Khanda, your body. Most of the time, it's like, let my arm go up, it goes up. But it's like you get old and sick and maybe you're going to say, let it go up, and it's not going to go up that time. So it's sort of like that. Or like volition, you can say, let me not ever be angry ever again. Well, that's not going to work. You can't just decide these kind of things. So you don't have complete control over everything. He's not saying you don't have any control over any of the 5 khandhas. He's just saying you don't have complete control over it so that you can say that it is you. I mean, if it was really you, if it was really yourself, according to the argument, you'd have complete control over it. So that's kind of the argument of the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta and sort of Theravada Buddhism's like official position with regard to that. But he says, see, if all this is true and there also is no self, and karma is a collection of energies, and it's the karma that is truly real. Well, I don't think that karma is truly real. I don't think that any mental state is truly real. Orthodox Theravada has, like, I think it's 128 ultimate realities, which would include volition, which is karma. But, I mean, according to Abhidhamma, there's 128 ultimate realities. So you've got Nibbana itself, you've got consciousness. There's supposedly only one kind of consciousness, but there's various like flavors of it in Abhidhamma. It's kind of weird the way they worked that one out. You've got, I think it's 28 different kinds of matter, earth element, fire element, wind element, even the space between molecules is considered to be an ultimate reality. And then I think it's 52 mental states, which includes volition, also includes perception and a whole slew of other mental states, including wrong view, tongue sensitivity, eye sensitivity, with regard to the sense organs. That's all rupa, I'm pretty sure. So from the Orthodox Theravadan point of view, karma is not the only reality. From my point of view, consciousness would be what is real. That consciousness is the essence. Like porcelain or ceramic earthenware is the essence of this mug. The form is the mental state. Or let's say you've got the uncarved block of marble. I beat this one to death. A lot of people hear me say it probably dozens of times by now. They still don't fully understand it. Some people probably don't. It's just a weird idea. The human brain was not designed to understand this kind of stuff. But you've got this uncarved block of marble, and contained within that block of marble are every possible statue in virtual, potential, conditional form. It's every molecule is already in the right place for that statue. You got Myron's discus thrower. You've got the Venus de Milo with and without arms. You've got Laocoon and his sons being eaten by snakes. You've got Rodin's The Thinker. You got every possible statue in there. Every possible one, including an infinite number of statues that nobody has ever bothered to carve in real life. But they're all in there in potential form. So perception would be singling out one of these statues out of this uncarved block, using imagination. And karma or volition it'd be sort of like the momentum of that perception as the perception changes. So you've got a statue that's dancing. I mean, you've got dancing statues in that block of marble also. I mean, nobody could really carve one. But still, it's in there, in that block of marble, every possible statue, even a bunch of impossible ones. You've got statues moving around, doing all kinds of stuff in there. And so karma or volition is kind of like the momentum of one form of a statue that is like undergoing change. So karma would be it would be like the momentum of a kind of perceived entity. But all of it is just, only the block of marble would be ultimately real, going with the metaphor or the simile. So let's see, what is the actual question here? What the heck is karma really? Yeah, it's the momentum of perceptions, really. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to the next question. This is also from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And Ethiopian Fake Tig is asking long questions this time. I mean, I probably won't do it, but it would probably be helpful to me to have like a limit, no more than like 120 words per question, something like that. I haven't bothered to count these. It may be that they're within 120 anyway. But Ethiopian Fake Tig says, the first time Carl Jung and Freud met, they spoke for 13 hours nonstop. Well, I hope they at least like stopped to drink tea or something. Every once in a while, one of them might have to go to the bathroom. Anyways, he continues here, and Jung explained his idea of synchronicity. He went on to explain that once a big table in his kitchen completely split in half spontaneously, and he said it was the psychic energies of the family being manifest in real life. Then Jung would go on to point out that another one of these synchronicities would happen right then and there while talking to Freud, and then soon as he said that, a very loud bang would be heard from one of the bookshelves in Freud's room. What are your thoughts about this phenomenon? So it's synchronicity, sort of an acausal, connecting principle. I think Jung caused it. It was sort of like significant coincidence. And now, according to a different legend, Einstein went to talk with Jung and persuaded him to publish his essay on synchronicity because it was still in accordance with science at the time. Anyways, let's see. What's the actual question? What are your thoughts about this phenomenon of synchronicity, I guess? Anything is possible. I mean, from my point of view, the world we're living in is like a manifestation of our own mental states. I'm not a materialist. I do not consider physical matter to be real. The world we live in is essentially perception. Perception is samsara. So, I could kind of use the arguments of one of my favorite books, The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, who says that, we're living in a world that needs order, it needs rules, it needs laws to just kind of stave off dangerous chaos. The world we're living in our waking consciousness is more stable than our dream state, where you can be riding a boat and all of a sudden it turns into a bus. You didn't get off the boat and onto the bus. It just turned into one when you weren't noticing. You're talking to somebody who stops being that somebody and starts being somebody else while you're having the conversation with them, that kind of thing. And there's less order in our dream states than in this waking state. But still, this waking state is not just completely, absolutely stable. We've got laws of physics, so to speak, laws of nature, let's say, because the physicists aren't making the laws. They're just trying to discover them. But apparently, according to like George P. Hansen, even just the laws of nature are not enough to fully lock down our world into something stable enough to hold scary, weird, like paranormal events, chaos at bay. And so we've got to have human rules, human laws, traditions, taboos, that kind of thing, just like cultural norms and beliefs to further stabilize the world we're living in. But still, you can't have absolute, complete stability, because then it's like the inspiration of like being alive would just, it'd just be like some dead robotic kind of world. There's always going to be cracks and weak spots between the rules that can allow like chaos or magic, the paranormal, to kind of seep through into our reality. And like George P. Hansen points out in his book, there are some people, like, traditionally witches, who would deliberately violate taboos. He points out that a lot of talented psychics, they've got like sexual kinks and so forth. They're never completely straight. They sort of create liminality. They create weak spots in the rules that allows, more paranormal stuff to come through. Witches would like harness that, channel it, and utilize it to accomplish their goals, that kind of thing. You know, that's one reason why human sacrifice was considered so powerful. It was a very liminal thing. You know, you were sort of tearing the fabric of normality by doing this kind of stuff. And then if you were skillful enough, you could then harness like the chaos energy coming through into this version of reality to, you know, accomplish some paranormal goal, so to speak. So, yeah, I think that synchronicity, I mean, it does happen. I've had like lots of weird synchronicities in my life. So, yeah, I think it does happen. It's mainly we're like at a more sophisticated, more conscious level of a dream state, but we're still not in ultimate reality. The world we're living in is still a kind of dream state, or like the Matrix or some such. A virtual reality, not an ultimate one. So this kind of stuff can come through, especially for liminal sort of people that are like not completely playing by all the rules. So I guess I explained that well enough for the purposes of this video, I hope. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Susan. And Susan says, "Hi, I'm a mother who listens to your channel." Hi, Susan. You're one of the few women that do listen to this channel. It's like 98% male who listen to these Q&A videos for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure why that is. But Susan says, first, what is your favorite movie? And traditionally, my favorite movie is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But the thing is, it's sort of like a favorite song where you've listened to it so many times that it just doesn't have the same effect anymore. I've watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail several times. And so, you know, it's kind of, the freshness of it is kind of worn thin. Another favorite movie, possibly number 2, would be The Matrix. And some people might think, well, Monty Python and the Holy Grail and The Matrix are like 2 very different kind of movies, but there's similarities between Monty Python and the Holy Grail and The Matrix. Like both of them are dealing with different levels of reality within the movie. Both very imaginative, kind of supernatural in certain ways. But yeah, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, especially the whole scene with Tim the Enchanter, is just from beginning to end. The Tim the Enchanter stuff is probably my favorite part of my favorite movie. There are some who call me Tim. And I'm just going to move on to Susan's next question here. Next, she says, I have a son who has spent time as a novice Buddhist monk and identifies as a Buddhist. He now has a girlfriend I think is abusive. What kind of advice can I give him about this? I know that he has thought deeply about dedicating his life to being a monk. I don't think he thinks I understand him, but I only want him to find peace and happiness. Okay, so you've got a young man who has a girlfriend that his mother thinks may be abusive. And I mean, my experience as a young man with girlfriends is, I mean, there's a certain amount of abusiveness that's going to be, I mean, women kind of use, well, not all women, but it's fairly common for women to kind of use a certain kind of abuse, you know, just getting pissed off and like having scenes or certain ways of trying to manipulate the guy, this kind of stuff. I think that's just natural human nature. Yeah, I definitely, one of the main girlfriends I had like in college, yeah, my brother considered her to be abusive. But the thing is, you can learn from that. I mean, if he's got some wisdom, I mean, he's probably going to either realize that she's abusive and do something about it, or like I was doing throughout much of my time with that particular girlfriend I had in college, is you just consider the abuse to be worth it overall. So, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, it seems like throughout the history of the human race, men and women, it's just kind of amazing to me that the male and the female psychology still, they're after a million years of human beings on this planet, they still just don't fit together very well. There's a certain amount of like friction or just not fitting correctly that, it has worked sufficiently to perpetuate the species. Maybe it's even promoted that to some degree. But you'd think that after a million years or more, that, it would be a kind of a smoother interaction. Kind of a more functional symbiosis like storks or geese have than the weird kind of just sort of, I don't know what you call it. I keep wanting to say the word anomaly, where it's just like this anomalous fit, or it's weird. But, people just think it's worth it. Sort of like the old saying men have about women: you can't live with them and you can't live without them. You can live with them and you can live without them, but, it's the saying. And most men choose not to live without a woman. I choose not to live without one. So let's see, I'm not exactly sure how she is abusive. So that's one thing. If she's just sort of, getting mad at him in order to like manipulate him, this kind of stuff, or pretend to be mad at him, or, threatening to break up. And then, you got the passionate kiss and make up love scene, which is the payoff, especially when you're young. It kind of, the passionate kiss and make up love scene, really, it's sort of like the dependent core rising, or the duality of it's like the payoff to the suffering that comes before. But exactly how the girlfriend is abusive, I'm not sure. As a mother, you shouldn't just think, I think she's abusive, because I don't think he's going to have much use for that. But I don't know what the son is like either. Probably the most that you could do without seeming obtrusive is, what's the deal with this? Just kind of casually ask him a question about, some sort of spectacle that you have observed or some such. But if he is, he's young. He's probably all doped up on hormones, as young people tend to be. So, so long as he doesn't, accidentally get her pregnant and be like honor driven to do the right thing, that kind of thing, then, some people, people as a general rule, we tend to learn from our mistakes more easily than we learn from somebody else's mistakes. So, I really don't know what the son is like, what the possibly abusive girlfriend is like. So I can't really, talk about, exactly what's going on. But if he does have wisdom, he apparently has enough wisdom that he has already been ordained as a novice monk and considers himself to be a Buddhist, has, a mind kind of directed towards Dharma to some degree. Then, unless something is really getting out of hand, then, I suppose you should have faith in his wisdom, and also just kind of allow young people to be young and do stupid stuff sometimes. But, if there is some danger of, him getting like permanently entangled, or, really getting like messed with or something, then even then, it's better just kind of ask him what's up, this kind of stuff, than, being too much of a mama bear. But yeah, I think I'd have to have more data to really come up with anything more concrete or certain than that. I survived a few girlfriends before I became a monk. You learn things. I should say it now. I was resisting the urge to mention that every man, there's one YouTube video every man should see to help them understand how to deal with women, or what woman to choose to live your life with, that kind of thing, just look up Hot Crazy Matrix on YouTube. It's everything a man needs to know about women, supposedly. But it's one thing in particular from that video has really been helpful to me in life. And that is that on a scale of 1 to 10, all women, at least from a man's perspective, all women are at least a 4 crazy. I mean, that just bearing that in mind can cause a man to be much more patient and less demanding. That, I mean, why isn't she making good sense here? That kind of thing. But, I mean, if he's got wisdom and that sort of thing, so long as he doesn't make some really grave mistake like getting her pregnant and then feeling duty bound to marry a woman that just really is not compatible with him, that sort of thing, then, I mean, to some degree, he should be allowed to make his own mistakes, I think. Man. So I'm just going to move on to the next question now. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, if you get good at Buddhism, is it like living in this world and never feeling a drop of cortisol again? And I'm not exactly sure what cortisol is. I mean, it's one of those kind of a neuroreceptor brain modifying hormone kind of thing going on up there. I guess. I really haven't been studying cortisol lately. I kind of put it in the same category as endorphins. Just one of those kind of brain chemicals. Let's see here. So if you get good at Buddhism, is it like living in this world and never feeling a drop of cortisol again? Well, I guess he's not saying if you're enlightened. He's just saying if you're good at Buddhism. And I'm not exactly sure what cortisol does. I suppose I should have looked it up. Maybe I should just see if I can do this. Just see, cortisol. Everyone should have a dictionary handy. Okay, biochemistry, noun, another term for hydrocortisone. So let's look up hydrocortisone. Fortunately, I can just click the blue link there. It says a steroid hormone produced by the adrenal cortex and used medicinally to treat inflammation resulting from eczema and rheumatism. What the actual freak? So it's a steroid hormone produced by the adrenal cortex used to treat skin disorders. Okay. So if you get good at Buddhism, is it like living in this world and never having a skin disorder? Or see, if you never feel a drop of cortisol, maybe you've got rheumatism and skin disorders that you just can't cure because you don't have any freaking cortisol. I mean, maybe he's talking about endorphins, or maybe it's sort of like what's the opposite of endorphins that make you feel unpleasant? Like you got those gruesome experiments on live monkeys where they cut off the top of their skull and then they put on this like cap with electrodes on, and they have them strapped into this cage where they can only like move one finger or something, and then they've got to like push a button to get like this squirt of fruit juice into their mouth. And then after they get used to it, they learn how to push the button at the right time to get the squirt of fruit juice. Monkeys like fruit juice. Then they switch it up and put salt water into their mouth. And then it's like the brain, parts of the brain light up. They're like, something's going wrong kind of a thing goes on. Maybe that's what Philalethes is talking about. It's like the something going wrong warning. Because I don't know why he would bring up like a treatment for rheumatism and, what was it, eczema? So if you get good at Buddhism, is it like living in this world and never feeling a drop of cortisol again? Well, I mean, it's sort of like, I hesitate to say it, but to some degree, it's sort of like microdosing on acid, where, it's sort of like I was saying earlier, where you're living in each moment more fully. And I mean, there's certain things you take to heart if you're good at Buddhism, like regret is always bad. It's always bad karma, just makes things worse. Regret and remorse, that kind of thing. get good at Buddhism, you have more compassion. I mean, you have more Christian charity. I mean, that's one of the main benefits that being a monk for 30 years has had on me, is that, I mean, I tried for 30 years to be a perfected saint, and it just didn't go as planned, partly for reasons I discussed earlier on in this video, where changing yourself is much easier said than done, and to some degree, we are stuck being who we are. So it's like, if I tried for 30 years to become a saint, and I do not have a saintly character. I just do not have a saintly temperament. I'm not saintly by constitution. So, I mean, if I tried for 30 years to have everything all worked out, have everything, just be completely fine, I mean, how can I expect that of other people? I have much more compassion for messed up people whose lives are in a shambles, or whatever. They've got these really bad habits, just character defects or whatever. It's like, I just have it like this deep feeling now that to some degree, I should just accept that and not expect them to change, because they're not gonna. As a general rule, most of them aren't going to change. At least they're not going to get rid of this character defect. So, I mean, some people, you're better off just not associating with them. That's fine. But I mean, it's just sort of like, go in peace, live your own life, and I'll go this way kind of a thing. So that's one aspect of being good at Buddhism, I guess. At least he didn't ask me, what's being fully enlightened like. Maybe he did that on purpose. Maybe he's already heard me talk about just the futility of trying to second guess a fully enlightened being. I mean, you're definitely going to be more mindful. And that's another thing. If you're good at Buddhism, might be another really important one, is you're kind of like observing yourself all the time. It's like if anger or greed or something arises, there's a certain part of your mind that's just observing that. You just get so used to being mindful that anything that arises, I mean, you can still be angry or greedy or whatever, or lustful, but there's more pronounced of this other part of your mind that's just observing the whole thing without any kind of judgment. Just being aware of it. And it's from the perspective of that part of your mind, the anger or the greed or whatever isn't you. You're like an actor playing a part, playing a role, but you're not like completely fully identified with it anymore. So that would be one symptom of having practiced Buddhism intensively for many years, or just being good at it. I think for some people, it might be just like a duck takes to water. You wouldn't need to do it for many years. You're just good at it automatically. Like some people are just automatically, they have the talent to be good meditators. So, I'm not sure about the cortisol though, and I'm going to move on to Phil Lathy's next question. So Phil Lathy's second question is, do you have an internal monologue? Do you think it is a good thing? Well, I do get head thinkings. Head thinkings is like when there's like talking in your head, you're like talking inside your own head. That's what head thinkings is like. Yeah, I get those. But I've read that some people just don't have an internal monologue. I mean, it's like an alarmingly high percentage of humans. I think there might be like certain like cultures in this world where it's way less common than in the West. Western people tend to be compulsive thinkers, so that Western people are much more likely to have an internal monologue. And throughout my life, I've had an internal monologue, although there are times when I'm just not thinking in words, so that, it's like I'm just looking at something, looking out the window at a tree kind of swaying in the breeze or whatever, and I'm just not thinking in words. So sometimes my woman, my wife, will ask me what I'm thinking about. And at the time, I just honestly have to say, I mean, I wasn't really thinking anything. I was just looking at the tree or whatever it was, just feeling comfortable under the blankets or whatever. So being a monk for many years has reduced my internal monologue. I don't think as much, although when it's necessary to think, I definitely think. And do I think that having an internal monologue is a good thing? I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. I mean, it can be used or abused. I think ultimately you'd be better off just in a state of intense mindfulness so that you'd only be thinking when there was a need to be thinking about something. So, it's from that extent, to that extent, it might be less of a good thing. But I mean, some people, it's like they haven't got to the internal monologue level yet. Sort of like I was talking about animals and like the clock that starts at midnight and has to go all the way around to get back to like God o'clock again. That was quite some time ago in this video. That, I mean, it could be that some people who are without an internal monologue just haven't gotten down to like 5 or 6 yet. Could be something like that. So in their case, it wouldn't be all that great of a thing because they haven't even, reached that level yet. Maybe most animals are better off not having an internal monologue. I mean, they don't think in words. So most animals would not have an internal monologue unless it's just like, visual images going off in their head, that kind of thing. But I mean, what kind of monologue would they have? It's just, their dogs dream at night. I've read that the American possum spends more time dreaming than it spends awake. But I mean, what are they dreaming about? They're just dreaming about, eating dog food off of back porches, that kind of stuff. Getting trapped in garbage cans, maybe. But ultimately, having an internal monologue is neither good nor bad. I mean, it depends on whether you use it or abuse it. But I do think a fully enlightened being would be thinking in words only when it was necessary for, performing some action that required thinking in words. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Raphael. This is kind of an easy one. Can you do a chat talk roundtable on Discord? And we've done at least one. I think we've done 1 or 2 in the past on Discord, just like an audio chat. I think the last time we did it was probably at least 2 years ago. That room in Discord does not get used much at all. But yeah, it's doable. I mean, we'd have to work out some kind of schedule. I noticed that, we have a lot of people in Europe and in like the Eastern Hemisphere in the group. So we'd have to work out a time like late morning, my time, which would then be like early evening in Europe, that kind of thing. Maybe that would work. And it would have to be like agreeable to my weird work schedule now. But yeah, it's possible. I mean, that could be discussed on Discord itself, I suppose. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. And this is the last question after a little over 2 hours. And I am happy to say that rebooting the computer apparently at least helped a little bit in that the lag rarely got more than about 1 second. So anyways, this last question is from Victorno. And Victorno says, is there any positive karmic benefit for a Catholic to go to confession? And personally, I think, yeah, it is beneficial to confess your misdeeds. In fact, in Theravada Buddhism, especially among monks, monks are required to make confession. Unfortunately, in Theravada Buddhism, confession has degenerated into this ritual formula of blah, blah, blah in Pali that means practically nothing. Like in Burma especially, as Venerable Sir, I have committed various offenses of various types. And that's as much of a confession as you make. I broke some rules of various sorts. And you're not saying what the rules are. In the original Pali, it's aham bande etanamam apatem apano dampati desemi, which is, Venerable Sir, I committed an offense of such and such name I confess it, which means you're supposed to say what you did. In Thailand, they get a little closer where they'll just say what category, but then they kind of fuck that up by just listing every category. So they'll just say, I committed offenses of this category, then I committed offenses of this category, whether they even broke any rules or not in that category. They'll confess patidesaniya offenses. There's a total of 4 patidesaniya offenses that are very obscure and nobody breaks them anymore. But they still confess them. And so it's still just meaningless blah, blah, blah. Which is unfortunate because I do think, like, if you read the texts, monks are supposed to confess when they break a rule. And even lay people can confess some misdeed that they have perpetrated to a monk or a wise teacher as a way of helping them to come clean and like help them to restrain themselves in future. So I do think that it is helpful for somebody who has done something wrong to confess it. And if you're confessing to like a priest or a fellow monk, someone who's compassionate and on your side, then some things that, you wouldn't be able to mention really. I committed this atrocity that, at least you're unburdening your heart and being open and honest about it to at least this one other person who may be under a vow of not divulging what you did, like a Catholic priest is supposed to be. But still, I do think that it has a positive effect. And from the Buddhist point of view, one of the main reasons for making confession is just to help you to restrain yourself in future. It's like, I did this thing, and then you're supposed to promise that you will restrain yourself in future, which is another bit of meaningless blah, blah, blah in the formula that monks do nowadays, where it's like, in the future, you should restrain yourself. And then it's like, yes, sir, very good, sir, I will restrain myself. When mostly they just break the same rules over and over again. It's like a years-long habit. Sometimes it's like keeping money. They have no intention of getting rid of their money. But so long as it's an honest confession, I think the kind of confession that Theravada Buddhist monks make, where it's just a meaningless blah, blah, blah at best, and at worst it's just flat out lying, then yeah, you're better off not lying or just indulging in meaningless babble. But if it's a genuine confession, I did this, misdeed, and I promise I will try harder in future to restrain myself, then I think there is positive results to be expected of that. So I do think that there is a benefit. Karmic benefit. He asks, is there a positive karmic benefit? I would assume so. Like some things, it's just hard to admit that you did something wrong. So you force yourself to overcome this pride or fear of punishment or whatever it is, then that would have a karmic benefit of, it's like this brutal honesty that is to your own detriment. That, some people just cannot go there at all. Some people have specialized in, like Ram Dass, one of my first spiritual teachers as a teenager. He had this amazing tendency to just admit really embarrassing things about himself that I admired. It's like, man, you didn't have to say that. That's like TMI or some such. But still, I had to admire that in him. That, it wasn't pride. He was just kind of admitting the worst stuff about himself. And honesty is definitely, there's karmic benefit to honesty, especially if it's coming with difficulty. You're having to like force yourself to like blurt out this thing that, it could be very much damaging to your reputation or whatever. You're admitting to having done this thing that people are wanting to know who did it, that kind of thing. It wouldn't be so much that way for a Catholic confession because it's kept a secret. I'm pretty sure even like a murderer can confess to a Catholic priest. I'm pretty sure the priest isn't supposed to go to the police. The mass murderer that you've been looking for, yeah, he made confession to me the other night. I don't think that they're even supposed to do that. But still, I do think there is a kind of catharsis or a closure, or at least it helps you to be honest and maybe to restrain yourself in future to just confess some misdeed that you have done to somebody else. And that's it. That's the last question. And I'm done. So, like I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer about Dharma, essentially, philosophy, certain other things, I've got a fair acquaintance with Western philosophy, Western literature, that kind of stuff. I can maybe answer questions about that. No more than 3 questions per person per episode. Please like and subscribe if you have not done so already. Although don't like it if you didn't really like it. That might be dishonest. And check out the URL links below, which includes the books I have for sale on Amazon, my other links to X and other kind of socially kind of things. And be happy.